set. We're set. Okay. So, good officially afternoon to everyone as we draw into our Torah study for the end of Genesis. We're not quite at the end of 2015, but we are at the end of the book of Genesis, which means we are now in Parashat Vayechi. Right, Vayechi, it's right there. And Vayechi, despite having the term life in its title, is going to culminate in two deaths. Who in particular is dying in this week's parasha? Jacob and Joseph. Excellent, exactly. Jacob and Joseph. And they're dealt with slightly differently, but this is going to be the more extended version of what happens when somebody dies. A lot of people have died in the book of Genesis so far, right? I mean, not just in the background, but even some in the foreground. We, of course, had the death of Sarah. We had the death of Abraham. We had the death of Isaac. And we didn't hear an awful lot about that. We heard that they were buried. We heard a lot about the burial choice, the location for Sarah, the purchase of the cave of Machpelah in Hebron. But we didn't hear much about the grieving, the mourning, and the what goes on afterwards. And so we're going to get a bit more of that today than we've ever gotten before. Sound good? Well, sound interesting, I should say. Yeah, maybe good is not quite the right word, but hopefully grief will be good. That's kind of the point of grief. So we're going to pick up on page 306 for our text, and we're going to be on chapter 50 and verse 1. And Harriet, I know that you're just aching to read for us.
Let's see if I can do that. Joseph flung himself upon his father's face and wept over him and kissed him.
This is his father just died at the end of chapter 49. I guess I should have begun with that.
Then Joseph ordered the physicians in his service to embalm his father, and the physicians embalmed Israel.
Remember, Jacob, Israel, same person? Good.
It required 40 days, for such is the full period of embalming. The Egyptians bewailed him 70 days, and when the wailing period was over, Joseph spoke to Pharaoh's court, saying, "Do me this favor and lay this appeal before Pharaoh. My father made me swear, saying, I am about to die. Be sure to bury me in the grave, which I made ready for myself in the land of Canaan. Now, therefore, let me go up and bury my father. Then I shall return." And Pharaoh said, "Go up and bury your father as he made you promise an oath."
Okay, so what do we got here about death? What happens when people die?
There seems to be quite a mourning.
What's that?
You mourn them.
All right, so we got mourning. And ironically, who do we hear about the mourning from?
The Egyptians.
The Egyptians.
The Egyptians.
Right, so we've got the Egyptians mourning, wait, how long?
70 days.
All right. 70 days. We're going to come back to that 70 number, don't worry. But I want to make sure we got it up on the board. What else needs to be done when someone's dead?
They embalmed him.
Yeah, that's not a Jewish thing.
Well,
They're Egyptians.
I don't know. But they're Egyptian. Jacob isn't Egyptian.
No.
Joseph isn't Egyptian. Why would they be embalming him?
You know, that's interesting because they won't sit at the same table. Oh, I'm sorry.
I'm sorry.
Because he's in Egypt?
Okay, so one thing would be when in Rome, do as the Romans.
They don't know any different.
That's okay. So one is this is what Egyptians do. The other might be, where is he going to be buried? Right? He's going to be buried in Canaan. He's going to be buried in Hebron, the grave that he has acquired for himself. That's Machpelah. Right? That's back up in the land of Israel. Carrying a body on the back of a camel between Egypt and Canaan, you want a little preservation. So if the 40 days of embalming is there as a preservation, that would make perfect sense. The only problem with that is he hadn't requested permission to go bury him until after that period was over. So it seems a little out of order here, right? Maybe?
Yeah.
I have a question
Yes.
also. It says that Joseph didn't lose his Judaism
Mhm.
while he was in Egypt.
Right.
But this to me sounds like he did. Because why would he suggest that he mourn 40 days?
So where's the whole 40 days coming from, right? It doesn't sound right. It doesn't sound the way we normally, right? What's the normal mourning period for Judaism?
30 years.
What?
11 months.
30 days, 11 months.
In general, not necessarily for a parent, but in general. The mourning period we're going to hear about for Moses, the mourning period we're going to hear about for Aaron, the mourning period we hear about for any of our own relatives, except for our parents. 30 days, right? So the number we were expecting as being good modern Jews was 30 days. Right? We were expecting 30 days of mourning. That's shoshim, right? That's the standard period of mourning after a death in Judaism for anyone other than our parents. For anyone other than our parents, right?
But
Even
to
for
be fair, this is long before the giving of the Torah. It's long before we have any customs. We have no rabbis or Talmud or anything to tell us what to do. So the only thing that's available is Egyptian custom.
Well, it's not before any custom, because remember, we buried Sarah, we buried Isaac, we buried Abraham, and we do know some of the customs. We know that when Jacob thought that Joseph was dead, we know that he rent his clothes, Kriya. More people coming?
My parents.
They count as people.
Yeah.
Those aren't people, those are my parents. Right, so we do know that there are some customs.
We know what they are.
And we do know that burial is a big part of them. We don't just leave our dead out. We don't cremate them. We don't throw them away. So there's definitely some customs, and that question of embalming is going to come back in our commentary. Don't worry.
But also, you're not supposed to touch dead bodies. So he's kissing his father.
It's not. Right. Let me see if I can navigate the double negatives here. It's not that you are not supposed to touch dead bodies. It's if you come into contact with a dead body, you become ritually impure, tameh, for a period of time until the ritual of the red heifer and all of that takes place.
Which is never going to happen.
Well, it doesn't happen back then because the red heifer hadn't been given as a mitzvah, and doesn't happen now because we don't have a proper cow. But my point is that you have to touch dead bodies because otherwise you can't prepare them for burial. So it's a mitzvah to take care, and there's nothing wrong with what Joseph does with his grief in crying over the loss of his father. So we don't go out of our way to come into contact with dead bodies. We don't have a fetish for dead bodies the way the Egyptians do. But
why didn't he make great effort to bury him the next day?
Okay, so why go through all of this embalming and allowing the national mourning rather than taking him the next day? Why the delay, which in Judaism we generally don't delay? We see that Abraham certainly doesn't delay when he buries Sarah, which is the most clear case where you have a death and then a burial. So why the delay? And we're going to have to come back to that of why there would be one.
I have a question pertaining to current times.
Mm-hmm.
If somebody is on a trip and dies,
Right.
and we want to bring that body back to the burial site here, how is the body prepared?
Oh, you mean in terms of embalming and other forms? Usually it varies state by state or country by country of what regulations they have.
If somebody dies in Israel and has to be brought back to this country, what process? We're supposed to bury as soon as we can.
Correct. And we do bury as soon as we can. Let's rather than Israel, which gets a little bit more complicated, let's say that somebody is on vacation in Egypt nowadays.
Okay.
Right, modern times. They're in Egypt, they're there seeing the pyramids, and they pass away. It's something they ate. I don't know. I'm making up a whole story as I go here. So they pass away, and we want to bring them back to the U.S. for burial in the family plot to be with their loved ones in their hometown, wherever it is. Every state or every country has their own laws regarding, and every airline regarding what can be brought onto their plane. And Jewish law does allow us to comply with those laws for the needs of the deceased. So you're right, we don't normally embalm our deceased, but if it's going to be a long distance journey, and if there is a law that requires them to be embalmed, then we do allow minimal preservation necessary for whatever the trip may be. If there are other issues involved, for example, requiring an autopsy, we will delay a burial if demanded by law, or for settling a criminal issue or something. We will allow an autopsy after death as well. We don't allow autopsies for casual reasons or for any other reasons. But if it is required by law, then we will. So there are exceptions in exceptional circumstances. But you're right, in the normal day-to-day type circumstances, we don't embalm, and we bury as soon as we can. So this should seem a little strange, and that's good. That means you're paying attention to both modern practice as well as what the text just said. Okay, so he gets Pharaoh's permission to go do the burial, which should also seem a little strange, right? I'm guessing that most of you wouldn't think you had to ask your boss, can I bury my father? But your boss is going to say no. You can't. I mean, you'd let him know, I've got to go and bury. But the Pharaoh very clearly says, well, since you gave an oath, then I guess you can go.
Right.
Which would seem to imply,
If you didn't.
if this wasn't an oath kind of thing, then I'd probably say, let someone else do it. But because you gave your word, begrudgingly, I'll let you go.
Is that because Egyptians take their oaths seriously?
Well, it certainly does seem to be that there was a feeling throughout the ancient world that a vow or an oath mattered a great deal. And they did take them seriously, whether in Egypt or even among Canaanite society, and obviously among Israelite society too. But this notion that maybe Pharaoh doesn't want Joseph leaving.
Because recognizing how Joseph came there as a slave, if he leaves, he may not come back. This wasn't his choice to be in Egypt.
He may not come back, and Joseph's been good for the Pharaoh.
Yeah.
Right? Joseph is the kind of guy you want to keep around. It's kind of like, if you're the head of a major company and you've got a vice president that has been the rainmaker for your company, you don't necessarily want him leaving and getting ideas and meeting other people. You want him to stay right where he is in that beautiful corner office as a prison so he can keep making money for you. And this may be the first instance where we see a reluctance among the Egyptians to let us go. Because of what Pharaoh has done, what Joseph has done, Pharaoh begrudgingly gives in, but we already begin to see that the Egyptians, they're kind of happy to have us around as long as we're in the right position, as long as we're properly managed. But this is sort of the first foreshadowing that leaving Egypt may not be as easy as it was to get in.
Yeah.
Make sense? That's part of the little setup for the next book, the book of Exodus. All right, keep reading a little bit more to hear about the funeral.
So Joseph went up to bury his father, and with him went up all the officials of Pharaoh, the senior members of his court, and all of Egypt's dignitaries, together with all of Joseph's household, his brothers, and his father's household. Only their children, their flocks, and their herds were left in the region of Goshen.
Sound familiar? Remember, that was the initial discussion between Pharaoh and Moses, when Moses says, we want to go off to worship in the wilderness. He doesn't say immediately we want to stop being slaves. He just says we want to go worship. And Pharaoh says, well, as long as you leave your kids and your flocks behind, that's okay. Pharaoh was simply doing what this Pharaoh had done, right? Which is, okay, yeah, you can go bury, leave the kids and your money here. Flocks are cash, basically, in the ancient world.
Chariots too, and horsemen went up with him. It was a very large troop.
So this is a major a major parade, as it were, that Egypt is marching up with Jacob and Joseph for this burial. And remember, Egypt essentially had a projected power over the land of Canaan at the time. They at different times in Egyptian history, they ruled that land, and at other times they simply were a shadow over the land. But no one in Canaan was going to tell the Egyptians, no, you can't, because anyone who did that would have been smacked pretty hard.
Is there any indication that the chariots are there also to ensure that Joseph will return?
There's certainly a hint of that.
Yes.
Is the armed escort to protect or to make sure they come back? There is definitely a little ambiguity going on there.
Well, also telling him to leave his kids behind
Yeah.
is absolutely he's going to come back. But he leaves the kids behind, so you will assure that he will come back.
You would certainly hope so. Exactly right.
Yeah. When they came to Goren HaAtad, which is beyond the Jordan, they held there a very grand and solemn lamentation. And he observed a mourning period of 7 days for his father. And when the Canaanite inhabitants of the land saw the mournings at Goren HaAtad, they said, "This is a solemn mourning on the part of the Egyptians." That is why it was named Abel Mitzrayim.
Which Avel Mitzrayim is mourning of Egyptians.
Beyond-
Mourning meaning cry mourning, not mourning like beginning of the day mourning.
Right, which is beyond the Jordan. Thus, his sons did for him as he had instructed them. His sons carried him to the land of Canaan and buried him in the cave of the field of Machpelah, the field near Mamre, which Abraham had bought for a burial site from Ephron the Hittite. After burying his father, Joseph returned to Egypt, he and his brothers and all who had gone up with him to bury his father.
Okay. Any questions while I get the handout out? Yeah.
Well, we got the 7 days of mourning in there.
We did, but it came a little bit out of sequence.
Yeah, a little.
Look at the way the air cushion just
Yeah.
helped that sail
That was
right
good.
across. Well, I practiced now for a few years of sailing it across the table. All right. So we're going to have to untangle a little bit of what's going on here. We have to untangle first the mourning. We also have to untangle why the Egyptians gave kavod, why they gave honor to this guy, stuffy in here, why they gave honor to this guy, Jacob. So let's go ahead and take Rashi, which is always a great place to start as he handles this question.
40 days during the period of embalming and 30 more days for mourning.
All right. Remember, I get to interrupt you. That's
Yeah, you do.
rabbinic prerogative. So what do we do with our 70? What's the beauty of Rashi's reading of our tradition?
Oh, I see. 40 days.
Right? The 40 was for embalming, which means there was 30 left over for wailing, for the mourning period, which means there's your shloshim, right? Shloshim. It's harder in English. So we have 40 for the embalming and 30 for shloshim. And so he's basically saying, yes, this was the normal mourning period, preceded by the abnormal embalming Egyptian custom. But the 30 days did happen. And it did happen as you would expect and as you would be familiar with, says Rashi, to his own audience, which is us. Well, us of 1,000 years ago plus us today. A neat little way of solving that problem, that the shloshim is in there. You just have to pull out the 40 from embalming, as mentioned by the Torah, and you're left with the 30 that we would expect. Okay? We're going to get back to that embalming in just the next couple comments, but let's finish this one.
They wept for him during so long a period because a blessing had come to them on his arrival in Egypt. For the famine then ceased and the waters of the Nile again increased.
All right, so think about when Jacob arrived. He arrived when the famine was in the midst, and so when he arrived coincided with when the famine began to end. Right? Joseph came before the famine began, and he was there for the years of plenty and did all the stockpiling. But when Jacob showed up and the 70 of his household, that was right around the same time that the famine would have stopped. So they associated Jacob with the end of the famine. And that's somebody to go, yeah, this guy, when he came, that's when the famine stopped. And so all of Egypt kind of felt good about Jacob. They liked him. Make sense? Maybe. So he's answering the question, why did all of Egypt care about Jacob? Everybody in Egypt knew Joseph. Why would they care about Jacob? Just because he's Joseph's dad? Right? It's not normally the way to be so enthusiastic about the father of somebody, especially a politician, who hadn't done something for you. And so Rashi tries to explain why they had a good association with Jacob and why the people would consider his loss to be their loss. That this source of blessing had gone. Indeed, there is some that argue that the Egyptians didn't want to let Jacob's body be taken out because they considered, as Egyptians were in the ancient world, the body to be important to hold on to as a continuing sign of connection. Right? And so the whole pyramid thing and all the tombs of the kings and whatnot, the body mattered to the Egyptians big time. And indeed, Joseph's body when you read further on through Vayechi on your own time, doesn't leave Egypt. Joseph is kept in Egypt by the Egyptians, and Moses has to go and find his body before he can leave Egypt during the Exodus. Moses goes and gets the body of Joseph in order to fulfill the promise that Joseph has everyone else swear to him, which is, when you leave this land, you take me with you. And there's a whole other discussion of why did Joseph have them keep his body in Egypt rather than having himself be buried the same way his father was. But that's for another day. Okay? Okay. Back to the embalming.
Gosh, okay. They made his bodily remains stench-proof, emptied his bowels, stomach, etc. Afterwards, they inserted various spices into the orifices of his body so that it would not decompose. We have a similar expression in Song of Songs. The fruit of the fig tree were sweetened.
Right. So how do you sweeten fruit? Right? How do you make fruit sweeter? Well, you embellish it. You add some extra spices to it. You spruce it up a bit. And what Vayechi is doing here is saying the embalming isn't the embalming of the yank out all the organs and pull the brain through the head, the nose, like they said the Egyptians did, and all of that kind of embalming. This is just a minimal amount of preparing the body so it doesn't decompose for the trip, which is less invasive than the embalming that we're all familiar with, or the embalming that would have been used by most of the ancient Egyptians. So he is dialing back what our minds imagine when we hear the word embalm. That make sense?
So he's not embalmed to the extent that he would still be not decomposed and not dead.
Exactly. He's not a mummy.
Right.
They didn't turn him into a mummy is basically what he's saying here. So all they did was, it's not pretty. They emptied the bowels to make sure there's no nasty stuff still left inside of him, and they emptied the stomach so nothing's going to rot from there, and they stuffed some spices in the various bits that might stink, and that'll help it not be so bad. But it's more of just a temporary preservation than it is the full-on, this body will never decay and you'll be in the British Museum one day.
But are they saying that they only did that so it wouldn't decompose before they got there to Canaan? That
seems to be the implication for Vayechi. However, Midrash Rabbah is going to fight back and say no, that wasn't what happened, that this embalming really was as invasive as you might have imagined, that this was the mummification style that Egypt is famous for. So read the next comment.
Why did Joseph die before his brothers?
Meaning, Joseph at the end of Vayechi is dying, and he is having his brothers swear to him that they will take care of his body and that it'll be buried in Israel when they leave Egypt. And the question is, well, wait a minute. Joseph was like one of the youngest kids, right? So why did he die before they did? It should be oldest kid dies first and second oldest dies next. And yes, we may be familiar with the notion that it doesn't always work out that way, but they're saying they're all dying of old age. And if they're dying of old age, they should be dropping off roughly in age order, certainly not next to youngest going first. And so they have to come up with an answer of why was his time cut short?
Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi said, because he embalmed his father. The Holy One, blessed be he, said to him, could I not guard my righteous ones? As I said, fear not, Jacob the worm.
All right, so we're going to come back to that phrase at the very end. I just want to make sure we get the sense of this before we hear this really novel proof text reading. So what he's saying is, Joseph died because of punishment. God was saying, you shouldn't have embalmed him. Why did you let this happen?
Yeah,
because
I could have kept him.
Yeah, I'm not going to let him stink. Right? I'm God. If I don't want the body to decompose on the trip, he won't decompose on the trip. So why do you think you have to pump him full of spices and herbs and do all of this stuff? And the proof text that Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi uses is really very clever, because there's this phrase in Isaiah, which is really a strange phrase, because it's where God is giving us, what's the term? Encouragement. He is trying to say, don't worry, it'll be okay, Israel. Everything is fine. But in the process of giving us all this encouragement, he calls us a worm. It literally says, or not literally says, that's misleading. It usually is translated as saying, fear not, O worm Jacob. Right? That meaning that we are the worm. But what he did was flip the way to read it to say, don't fear the worm, Jacob. You don't have to be worried about decomposing and maggots and all of that stuff because God will look after you, Jacob. And Jacob is the guy we're specifically talking about.
But is it because he did the embalming, Joseph did the embalming, or is it because he didn't bury the body right away?
Well, this particular text is trying to indicate that it was the embalming that was a problem. And certainly we know that Judaism has internalized that notion. Sorry, I didn't mean that for a pun. We have taken on board that notion that the body should not be tampered with between death and burial, except for exceptional reasons. Like we mentioned before, if you're halfway across the world or other things, then yes, we do allow some preservation. And indeed, in the ancient world, for example, if someone died in Babylon during the Talmudic period and the body was going to be buried back in Israel, you were looking at a month-long journey with a cart, and they did use some preservative methods to make sure the body could get from Babylon to Israel without just rotting in the most horrible way. So some preservation was permitted, but this is basically saying, no, specifically with regards to Jacob, somebody like him, you should have let God take care of it. You didn't need to bother with it. So it's almost as though God is saying, it's not just that you shouldn't have embalmed, but you shouldn't have embalmed him because everyone would know he's my righteous, and by him not rotting, it would have been a sign to everyone about the reward for the righteous. And that idea of, is there a different way we treat the righteous in death than the non-righteous is going to come back later on in our commentary. But I can see you have something to say or react.
Well, no, it sort of reminded me when Moses struck the rock and God said, you didn't allow me to show to the people who I am.
Right.
This is sort of the same thing. If Jacob had not spoiled on the way over there.
You trumped my big act. You upstaged me.
You upstaged me.
Right, here I was, just about ready to show everybody that the righteous wouldn't rot. And now all they're going to say is it's because they shoved, parsley, sage, and, thyme into you. Rosemary and thyme. Well, no, you don't stuff them with Peter, Paul, and Mary.
One more thing.
Yeah.
The people who, like I have a friend whose parents, they lived in Pennsylvania. They died in Maryland.
Right.
And she promised them that she would bury them in Israel.
Right.
So it had to be within 24 hours. So do they have to preserve the body for the flight? So
usually, from what I understand, most airlines either require a certain type of minimum preservative process, or they require certain special coffins to make sure that nothing can be transmitted during that travel time from the decay process.
But they change the coffin when they get to Israel?
Yes. Yeah. I mean, that's certainly permissible. And we are blessed to live in a time now where we can expedite funerals, long distance funerals like that, in a way that we never could have in the past. In the past, if you wanted to be buried in Israel, they would have had to put you into brine or salt or something else to keep you from being horribly rotten and falling apart. As they put you on a boat, that would take a month or two to get to Israel. So yeah, we're fortunate to live when we live.
In our family, an uncle was buried in New Jersey, and then they later
reinterred.
Oh
yeah.
Yeah. We generally don't reinter unless it is specifically for the kavod of the deceased. So, for example, if there was some reason why they couldn't be interred in the family plot, I know this comes up in places, or used to come up in places where the ground was frozen during the winter, and before they had backhoes and everything that could cut it, they would dig. Talk about being macabre. You would dig graves before winter began, and you'd say, okay, here are 10 graves. And if 11 people die, then someone else had to go out there and crack the ice and try and dig for them. But more specifically, if one of those 10 people who did get a grave died actually should have been buried in the family grave, when the thaw came, they would have to dig the family grave and then exhume and inter them where they were supposed to be with their family. But you do it for the family. You don't do it just to clear that area so you can build a house. You don't do it just because it's convenient or someone paid you more for that piece of land, so you're taking him up and dumping him somewhere else and selling the plot again. But for the honor of the deceased, then yes, under some circumstances, we can reinter. Okay, so let's get back to our whole burial entourage.
40 days were spent embalming his body, and 30 days of weeping for the absence of this man henceforth.
Right, that's what mourning is, right? We mourn somebody not because we're sad for them that they're dead in particular, because of course the soul is eternal, but we are sad that they're not going to be around anymore, right? And that's the essence of our personal mourning.
We find that both Moses and Aaron were mourned for 30 days. You see that in Numbers and Deuteronomy. The difference was that Moses and Aaron were mourned after they had been buried, whereas Jacob was mourned prior to his interment.
Right, which we noticed, with all seemed that the schedule was out of whack. And Radak, our commentator, is going to try and help us with this.
This was permissible, as the embalming procedure was equated with a kind of burial.
Right, it was like a pseudo proto burial by preparing him in this way, is what Radak is saying, and therefore, once he was prepared, it was kind of like he was already buried. He was mobile, but he was also buried. He was in a mobile grave, is the way he's envisioning this.
During all these days, the Egyptians wept out of respect for the feelings of Joseph.
Right, so again, notice that Radak's first explanation of why were the Egyptians upset was just because they liked Joseph and they cried for his father because Joseph was crying. But
according to a view quoted by Rashi, the Egyptians also mourned him, being aware that this man had been able to arrest the famine 5 years before it had run its predetermined course.
Right, so he argues as well with what Rashi says, okay, it was also for Jacob's own merit. So he brings in both aspects. Okay, but it's interesting the way he puts this twist that this type of embalming now was so extensive that it was almost like he was buried even though he wasn't in the ground. And so therefore, beginning Shloshim, which only begins once burial has taken place, that's one of the reasons why we don't delay burials, because you don't begin Shiva, you don't begin Shloshim until the burial happens, or until you're no longer connected with the burial. He's trying to explain, how did Shloshim begin if he wasn't in the ground? And he's saying, well, this embalming process, this preservation process was like a pseudo-burial, and that's why Shloshim could happen here. Whether you buy it or not, well, Radak, he has his own opinion. Other people argue against him. But again, let's talk about this respect being shown.
Not only out of respect for Joseph and because of his decree of public mourning, but also because he was revered for his name Israel and what this name stood for. He deserved the same respect as royalty.
All right, so now we're taking Jacob and saying, Jacob had a special name, which was Israel, and Israel has is a name that has meaning, and that name is as good as any royal family name in the world. You can be the Windsors, or you can be the Habsburgs, or you can be the B'nai Yisrael. You're right up there in the category of royalty. It's not bad, but what does that name stand for? I don't mean literally what does it stand for. What is it meant to represent? To say to be called by the name of Israel. Why would that be equal to royalty?
We are the children of God.
We're the children of God, right? We serve God, we serve Torah. That's as good as being blue blood royalty, is what they're basically saying here. And therefore Jacob, who was the first to be called Israel, deserves to be treated like a king. So he deserves the full Egyptian treatment and state mourning. The entire country should weep because he died, right? Because he deserves that. Not because he was a king, but because he was Israel. But that royalty thing actually brings up a question which none of you noticed. But maybe that's because we're not used to dealing with kings.
Right. He used intermediaries, as a mourner in garments of mourning is not allowed to appear before the king.
All right, and just for the proof text on that, something you might be more familiar with, turn the page and give me the top text.
Now, when Mordecai knew all that was done, Mordecai rent his clothes and put on sackcloth with ashes, and went out in the midst of the city and cried with a loud and bitter cry. And he came even before the king's gate, for none might enter within the king's gate clothed with sackcloth.
right? Remember the whole idea that Mordechai couldn't come in wearing the sackcloth? We read this when we read the Megillah, and that's because you don't go into the palace wearing garb of mourning. That's not how you appear in the king's palace. And if you look back very carefully at the text that we read on page 307, and you read verse 4, and when the wailing period was over, Joseph spoke to Pharaoh's court, saying, do me this favor and lay this appeal before Pharaoh. Why would Joseph, number 2 in the whole country, have to ask them to go on his behalf to Pharaoh? Because how was he dressed? He was dressed as a mourner, exactly. Joseph was dressed as a mourner and therefore couldn't appear before Pharaoh. And so he had to ask the other people to do the intermediary, to go and talk to Pharaoh and ask him to do this and to tell him that he had made a vow to his father to bury and da-da-da-da. He's doing that all through intermediaries to Pharaoh, because he can't appear before Pharaoh himself while wearing the garb of mourning. And he's not taking off his mourning cloth just to go talk to Pharaoh, right? Because he is a mourner now that his father has died. Make sense? Right? So how we appear at the end of life and how our dead appear at the end of life is a topic that has gone through a number of different stages and developments in Jewish history. Right now, when we bury somebody, how are they buried according to Jewish tradition? In a shroud, right? In tafrichim, right? It's a simple garment, right? It's just made of white linen, and that's it. There was a time when that wasn't always the case. There's a much longer story where Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel saw that people were getting too fancy with the funerals, and the way people were being dressed and the elaborate funerary rites, and the people who were wailing and you hired and all of that. It's like hiring a band, but with crying. Was making other people who were poor so embarrassed that they weren't even burying their dead. They were just dumping them by the side of the road because they didn't want to be humiliated that they couldn't put on as lavish of a ceremony. It'd be like, saying to your kids, just elope, because I don't want anyone to know that we can't have a big wedding. Only rather than a wedding, it's a funeral. So there was a time, and when he died, he gave orders that he would be buried in just white linen clothes, and that was it. And after that, everyone said, well, if it's good enough for him, it's good enough for us. But prior to that, there were options of what you wanted to be buried in. What would you like to be buried in? And there's a lovely discussion from Midrash Rabbah about what you might want to get buried in.
Rabbi Yochanan instructed, bury me in colored shrouds.
I want to be buried in colored garments. So not just white, not just black, which were two common choices at the time. Bury me in mixed colors.
If I am summoned with the righteous, the wicked will not notice. And if I am summoned with the wicked, the righteous will not notice.
Okay, so you got to put on your imagination here. You are dressed all in white, right? Because you are so pure and you are so holy and you are buried. And the day comes for the resurrection of the dead. The Messiah has come, the world is perfect, and the dead rise from their grave. And according to Rabbi Yochanan, he's imagining himself rising as he was laid down. And he comes up and he's dressed in the white, and the great horn goes, the shofar gadol, and all the righteous to this way and all the wicked to that way. And he's wearing white, but he's told to go that way. And so now he's got to go stand with all the other people who are dressed in black, and he's wearing his white. He's going to stand out like a sore thumb. Right? He's going to stand out like a sore thumb, and vice versa. What if he says, okay, well, maybe I'm a sinner, so dress me all in black. And then the end of days come, and he is called to go this way, and he's standing over here amongst all these guys in white, and he's wearing black. It's going to feel rather stupid. Okay, it's a cute image, and it's a wonderful way of thinking about the end of days, of the division of people for judgment. But that's not just what he's talking about here. What he's talking about is, do you think of yourself when you're coming close to your death as being among the righteous or among the wicked? How do you weigh yourself? And he's basically saying, I don't know. Who am I to say that I have earned a place among the righteous. Or who am I to say I've earned a place among the wicked? So bury me in blue, and then I won't stand out because I'm just that guy in blue. And no one will think, oh, he thought he was so righteous, but he ended up being wicked, or he thought he was so wicked, but he ended up being right. It'll just be, oh, look, he's buried in blue. He's basically saying that it's unknowable for him to know where he stands in the great scale of the universe. So he'll leave that in God's hands. He's not going to presume to claim which group he belongs to. But Rabbi
Josiah instructed, clothe me in white hemmed shrouds. They said to him, why do you say the opposite of your teacher?
Like, wait a minute, Rabbi Yochanan, your teacher said, dress me in colored things, and you're saying, no, I want some white on mine. You're contradicting your teachers?
He replied, why should I be ashamed of my deeds?
Right? So there's humility, but then there's also stupidity. You can be so humble to say, oh, no, I'm probably wicked. But look, if you've been studying Torah your whole life and doing the mitzvot and doing your best to rectify your errors and do tshuva when you make mistakes, chances are you really are not one of the wicked. That you may not know how righteous you are compared to the righteous of all generations. Okay, fine. You don't know where your ranking is, but you know you're not getting an F. So don't pretend like you're with the group that gets an F. Don't worry about being in the group who gets an F. You may get an A, you may be getting a B, but you're definitely passing. And that's what he's saying. He said there's a certain level of false humility that is unnecessary. It's good to be humble. It's an important part for doing tshuva, for repenting and making sure we constantly review ourselves. But that also can be taken too far. And so he's saying it's okay, acknowledge the white, right? Acknowledge the good that you've done and be proud of that and take some assurance from it that you're not going to be in the group that fails. Okay. Onward with Rabbi Meir.
Rabbi Meir would say, it is better to go to the house of mourning than to go to the house of celebration, for that is the end of all men, and the living will lay it to heart.
All right, so Kohelet, the book of Ecclesiastes, he's quoting from, saying it's better to go to a house of mourning than a house of celebration. If you've only got two places to go tonight, and one of them is for Shiva and the other is for a wedding party, go to Shiva, says Kohelet. Yeah, well, I mean, most of us would certainly pick the wedding.
Okay, I'm disturbed by this.
Yes.
So Joseph was thinking that he was doing his father good
Mm-hmm.
by preparing him to go and bury him in Canaan,
Right.
which is what he wanted.
Right.
Why weren't his brothers punished for selling him off to the Egyptians?
They are, and there are extensive commentaries that say not only were the brothers punished, but all of the tribes are punished in perpetuity for this sale. There are sages within the Midrash that say the destruction of the first temple and of the second temple and the martyrdom of the 10 great sages by the Romans were because of the sale of Joseph. So it definitely comes back over and over and over again that the brothers paid a very heavy price for their sale of Joseph. It's just in this particular instance, they're answering the specific question of why Joseph rather than his brothers when it came to this. Because you're right, we would have thought as far as bad deeds went, they had all done plenty of wrong. And so it would have kept even. And Joseph then still would have been the younger, which meant he should have outlived his brothers who were older. But he went first even still. So they had to come up with a new explanation for Joseph alone. And that's why they went for the embalming. But again, as you can see, not everybody agreed that the embalming was wrong. But we can always take the Bereshit Rabbah not as being that the sages knew specifically how God's scales were working with regards to Joseph, but that they knew what we needed to be reminded of, which is you do not unnecessarily fiddle with the bodies. You lay them to rest as quickly and respectfully as possible. And that was a very important lesson.
That was the more important mitzvah than the damage that he did to Joseph, that they did to Joseph.
You could argue that how he treated his father, and in some cases how people continue to treat their family or loved ones, can be a huge problem where they don't show the proper degree of respect, or especially in this case, carrying out the final wishes. But again, it's more about reflecting upon our own lives and deciding how we will carry out our family's wishes and what we'll do. That's right or wrong with regards to our tradition.
Okay, sorry, one more question.
It's okay. There's no limit.
Okay, so they sold Joseph to the Egyptians,
Mhm.
where he learned to embalm.
Yes.
So they are really responsible for the reason he embalms his father.
They certainly played a part in the drama, but Judaism ultimately always holds the person who does it as being responsible. If you hire someone to murder someone else, you are definitely responsible for the death, but the murderer is more responsible. Even though, yes, they probably wouldn't have murdered them without the money, the fact is they still chose to stick a knife in that person. And that act is their responsibility, no matter how influenced they were by someone else. As long as they had a choice, it wasn't, they were hypnotized and, mind controlled or some fanciful thing. As long as they had some way of saying, I could stab him or I don't need to stab him, then they are responsible for putting the knife in, no matter what came behind them. It's how abused they were, how poor they were, how angry they were. We can give them our sympathy, we can give them our kindness, and we can certainly try to make sure other people don't do the same, but they're still a murderer, and they need to face justice as a murderer. Okay, so going to the house of mourning, better than going to the house of celebration, and he's going to explain why, because it's not just because Kohelet is depressing.
What is the meaning of, and the living will lay it to heart? One who laments, others will lament for him. One who assists at a burial, others will bury him. One who bears the bier, others will bear him. One who raises his voice, others will raise their voice for him.
All right, we're going to pause there before we get to the others part. So notice what he did. He said, going to the house of mourning is better than the house of celebration, and the living will notice. And what he's saying is, well, what is it they notice? What they notice is that if you take time to mourn for others, if you take time to help with the burial of others, if you take time to grieve for others, people notice that, and they will do the same for you. When you pass, there will be people who will take care of you. Whereas if you ignore the needs of the dead, if you ignore the deceased, you don't show grief, you don't take care of anyone, you never go to a funeral, you never go to a shiva, oh, it's too depressing, I just want to remember them how they were, everyone's so sad. Guess what? No one's coming to your funeral. Your kids aren't going to be doing shiva for you if they never saw you go to shiva for someone else. You will reap what you sow, I guess you could say. And he's saying specifically when it comes to mourning rites, people tend to reciprocate. If they see you grieve for others, they will grieve when you pass. It's very much a interconnected relationship.
The Kohen are not supposed to go to burial.
To the burial, exactly. So if you are a Kohen, except for the immediate circle of family that you do have an obligation for, we don't ask them to come to the burial or to be in the room with the deceased. But to go to Shiva, absolutely. The Kohanim should go to Shiva and to pay respects and to offer condolences and do other forms of grieving for people that aren't within that immediate circle. Of course, we expect them to do that. It's just being at the graveside or being in the room with the deceased. There is a strong custom within some communities, I don't want to disparage it too much, of not going, but really there's no depth to that custom within Jewish tradition or law. There really isn't a problem.
Yeah, I'm smiling because I was pregnant at my grandmother's
Mm-hmm.
death, and I was allowed to go to the cemetery, but not to the burial site.
Right.
So I sat in the car.
So as I tried to explain, because I had this come up with me a few years ago, where a young woman came in who was pregnant and her grandmother had passed, and she said, can she go? Because some of the family are saying don't go, and some say do go, and she's really upset because she was so close to her grandmother. I say, look, Jewish law says it's fine for you to go. However, one of the reasons why the law is what the law, or the custom is what the custom is because many people find the funeral very distressing and very taxing. and many people find their family reaction very stressful and very taxing. So if going to the graveside is going to make the rest of the family lose it, and they are going to freak out, and that's going to become a pressure on you and make it hard for you during the rest of your pregnancy, because everyone is going to be saying, how could you have gone, you're risking your baby, da 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 da, then by all means don't go. On the other hand, if not going is going to weigh upon you because you needed to go to pay your respect and to be there for your grandmother as she was buried, then ignore your relatives and go. But for someone who doesn't have that tradition at all, who doesn't have that family dynamic, go. There is no reason not to go.
I was very young and very intimidated, and I was told you can't go, and I didn't go.
Right. Oh, see, you should have talked to me.
Yeah.
Although, if your family was,
You were definitely not born yet.
but if your family was that intimidating, it may have still been right not to go, although it would have been nice to have talked to the family about why they didn't want you to go.
I didn't question the mistake.
Right. Well, good. I'm glad to see that you've learned to ask questions so nicely. Okay. But there are others who go even further.
There are those who say, and he who does not raise himself with pride, others will raise him. Glorify not yourself in the presence of the king, and do not stand in the place of great men. For it is better that he said to you, come up hither, than that you be put down low in the presence of the prince.
All right, so this is from the book of Proverbs, which is being sort of tacked on. It doesn't really have anything to do with funerals or burial or anything, but he's basically saying, don't seek out opportunities to be in high position, because if you force your way up, there's a better chance you're going to be pushed down. On the other hand, if you make yourself available and everyone can see what a good person you are and how valuable you'd be to the court, chances are he's going to say, come hither. You know, the king will raise you up. And it's much better to be raised up by the king than to push yourself up only to be pushed back down. Good advice. Okay. Let's get to our summary of grieving process as we know it more familiar.
Is that Rabbi Levy?
Yes.
On the first 3 days of bereavement, a mourner should see himself as though a sword were hanging over him between his shoulders.
So the sword here is a symbol of death, right? It's they didn't use the term scythe like we do for the Grim Reaper, you know, for all of the Western imagery of death. They thought of death as coming with a sword. And so basically you should feel that death is looming over you. And that's part of the experience of mortality and of grief, that this is a wrenching experience. Your soul should feel like it has been tugged from this world and is being stretched between worlds because of the loss. However,
from the 3rd to the 7th day,
the rest of Shiva,
it is as if it stands in the corner opposite.
Right? The sword's over there. I'm here. I'm still grieving. I'm still mourning. This is a companion. It's in the room with me, but it's not bowing me down under it. It's not looming over my head. It's not a constant thought and weight upon my shoulders. This death is becoming a little bit more distant and livable in the same space.
Afterward, it is as though it were moving alongside in the marketplace.
And after that, it's there. And I don't forget. And that's part of grief, right? We don't ever forget the loss. We don't ever forget how much we miss the person. But also, it doesn't bow us down to the ground. It doesn't crush us with grief. And that's the process that Judaism tries to manage with grief. That we have these steps of doing Shiva and of doing Shloshim, of rending the garments, of doing the isolation of Shiva, and then the reconnection to the rest of the community. All of that is designed to both make us aware of our grief and then to help us move through it and eventually have it simply be walking with us, but not oppressing us, if that makes sense. And if it doesn't, don't worry, we get one more from Moed Katan that tries to summarize it a bit better.
Weep not for the dead, nor bemoan him, from
Which
Jeremiah.
obviously has to be explained, because how could you not weep for the dead?
Weep not for the dead excessively, nor bemoan him beyond what is reasonable.
Right? So of course you're going to weep, and of course you're going to wail, but there have to be limits. And that's what Jeremiah was trying to say. So
How so? 3 days are for weeping, 7 for lamenting, 30 for not getting a haircut, and not wearing meticulously groomed clothing.
All right, so that's our basic Shiva Shloshim period here. And notice that, again, throughout Jewish law, they emphasize the first 3 days of Shiva even more, that's the time when your eyes are running with tears. The rest of Shiva, yes, you should still feel very, very sad and very, very mournful, but it's not as just overcome with the pain and the grief. You're beginning to find, a balance between the tears and forgetting. And then for the rest of Shloshim, we continue not to get haircuts or shave, and we continue not to wear the freshly ironed clothes. Remember, back then they didn't do laundry every day or every week. Weren't ironing things constantly. Ironing clothes was a major ordeal and a major sort of, ooh, wow, I get to wear something freshly pressed. Think about wearing linen clothes that have only been pressed maybe once or twice a year. And I mean linen like, heavy flax linen. So it would have been scratchy and rough and very uncomfortable and pointy in places. And then when you press it, wow, this is what I like. That's the feeling you don't have during Shloshim. Right? That's not the time to wear your finest clothes because you're not supposed to feel that good. And after that, well?
After that point, the Holy One, blessed be he, says, are you going to be more compassionate towards him than I was toward Moses?
Right, so your brother has passed, and you are devastated, and you mourn, and you go through Shiva, and it is painful, and you go through Shloshim, and you don't get the haircut, and you don't wear the iron clothes and all of that, and then Shloshim is done, and you dedicate your life to mourning. Are you going to wear, Kriya, the torn clothes forever? Are you never going to get a haircut again? Are you never going to go to see a movie again? You're never going to go to a concert? You're never going to have a social party? And the answer, someone might say, well, yes, he meant so much to me, I could never possibly ever do those things again. And God says, what arrogance? What arrogance? I mourned 30 days for Moses. I, God, mourned 30 days for Moses. So me mourning for him, that's the maximum. Going more than that it's arrogant and it's unhealthy. It comes back again and again through other texts in our tradition. So yes, we have special ways of mourning for parents that last longer with regards to saying Kaddish and with regards to our social calendar mostly. But these primary forms, the not getting the haircut, the not wearing the iron clothes and such, those end at 30 even for our parents. We still remember them for much longer, but these primary forms of grief are finished at that point. And it's based mostly on this idea that God set an example and set a limit by how Moses was mourned. And no one should think that they need to mourn someone in these intensive ways more than they mourned for Moses.
Did you have a Kaddish prayer those days?
No. The Kaddish as a prayer for the deceased came quite a bit after this.
After
the Talmud.
after the Talmud.
Yes. Moed Katan is part of the Talmud, and Kaddish as a prayer for the deceased didn't come until, we're not actually 100% sure. It doesn't have a little, made on date for the Kaddish as a mourner's prayer. Probably a few hundred years after the Talmud was finished, did Kaddish become a common ritual for grieving.
Wasn't Kaddish?
Oh, I got to respect the hand.
How long are the mirrors supposed to be covered?
Most people only cover the mirrors for Shiva.
So
Just for the 7 days, yeah.
And how about the torn?
So the torn is interesting. So usually we wear it for the Shloshim period, all the way through. But in the ancient world, of course, it wasn't something that you attached to your clothes, it was your clothes. And there's a very complicated set of rules of when you can put a temporary stitch in it to close it up a little bit, and when you can restitch it perfectly. In the ancient world, you could do that sort of thing because the cloth was so rough anyway. But for parents, you could never make it a perfect restitch. You had to always make sure that it was a scar physically on the clothing. But on Shabbat, of course, you don't have public signs of mourning. So you would take your tunic with the rent and you would turn it back to front so that you didn't have the rent visible, but you were still wearing torn clothes as a sign of respect for the mourning, so that you didn't have that public sign of mourning on Shabbat. but it's a little bit more complicated now because of attaching the tear rather than tearing. Tearing our actual clothes nowadays is quite hard. A few times I have helped families who wish to, and it's really tricky to tear normal clothing without getting a good cut going to get those stitches opening up so you can really get some, little bit move.
And what does that really symbolize?
The tearing? Our grief. I mean, it is a ultimate physical, literal manifestation of how we feel. We feel torn because someone has died.
So when did it get reduced to a piece of wood material attached to you?
Coincidentally and ironically, when clothes became cheaper and easier to make, but much better quality, meaning that it was much harder to tear. So in the ancient world, you had like a tunic and maybe a cloak that went over it. And it was made from rough homespun wool or flax. And that stuff, you could tear no problem. And you could fix it. Not no problem, but it wasn't that hard. But with modern machine-made clothes that are much better quality and much tighter weave and much harder to tear, it became hard to do that. And also, we just have so many of them that you would have to tear every single shirt that you're wearing because you put a new shirt on, put a new shirt on, put a new shirt on for all 7 days. It's much easier to fulfill the feeling of it by having it there. But it is still one of the most powerful moments for people, even with the attached cloth, to tear it does still provide a very deep psychological and spiritual moment during the grieving process. It's as I try to tell people, we don't go in for stoic grief when it comes to Judaism. We wear it right there.
Two things. One is the ribbon is worn on one side, right side for parent.
Left side.
Left side.
We wear I should say we tear, whether it's ribbon or clothes. We tear over the heart for parents, and on the right hand side for any other relative, any other of the immediate relatives for whom we mourn officially.
And the second question, the Kaddish that David just asked.
Yes.
About, didn't the Kaddish de Rabbanan come first?
Yes.
And later on the extended?
Exactly. So Kaddish de Rabbanan, or the Kaddish in general, was originally written as a closing doxology, a closing statement of praise for God and our connection to God for times of study. So you would finish reading a text, or you'd finish studying, and you would say this beautiful statement of our belief and connection to God. It became the honor of those who were mourning to be able to say it. So the prayer was going to be said no matter what. It was just who gets the honor to get to say it. The same way that you might invite a guest to say Kiddush at the Shabbat table, or to ask someone else to do the zimun, the invitation for Birkat Hamazon at the end of the meal. You would honor those who were mourning. Would you like to do Kaddish in honor of your parents, or father, mother, brother, whatever? And eventually, which Kaddish was being given to the mourner became established by Jewish custom, because that way you avoided arguments of who was going to be doing it. And then a few other modifications happened. Certain phrases dropped out because it was considered inappropriate if the mourners were the ones who were saying it. So that's how we ended up with the current form that we call the mourner's Kaddish. And it's only been in modern times that the mourner's Kaddish became plural. It used to be mourner apostrophe S Kaddish. Now it's mourners S apostrophe Kaddish. It used to be that you had one mourner who said that Kaddish. And if you had more than one mourner in the room, you would add another text and say another Kaddish. And if you had another mourner in the room, you'd add another text and say another Kaddish, so that each person, each mourner, had a chance to recite the Kaddish for the loved one. When we got to communities of the size that we now have, it's fine when you've got a shtibel and you've got only one person or maybe two, but when you have 5, 10 people in the room, it became saying it together.
And my final question has to do with the length of the Shiva, which we've talked about 7 days.
Yes.
If I ever see a Shiva that's 7 days, I always say to myself, wow.
Yeah.
That's really, most of them 1 or 2.
Yeah. Well, so there's two parts to it. One of it is the Shiva in the sense of Shiva minyan, of how often are people coming around for a formal minyan. And that has really become much shorter. And that's mainly because people have become accustomed to having it with the coffee and the cake and the everything, and it's a whole ordeal, and we've got to have stuff out. And that has made Shiva a burden for those who are mourning. And it really has flipped Shiva on its head. Shiva is supposed to be a time when you are home and people come and they take care of you. But instead, for many people, it's become, I'm home, I'm sad, I'm depressed, I'm trying to grieve, and I have to get the coffee machine. And that
That's
is
why
why
we have community that does that.
Exactly. But unfortunately, a lot of people, they remember it from 20 years ago or 30 years ago when their parents went through it, when the parents did everything. And as a kid, they saw that and they said, you know what, when my parents die, I'm not going to do that. And so I always try to explain to people, you don't have to do that. Please, we have the community can do that. But people say, no, and they bow out. But I do encourage, and many people still sit Shiva privately. And if people want to come by, friends, to pay respects during that 7 days, many people do stay home for 7 days. They just don't have a public moment when everyone comes and davens together, which is a shame. But at least they do have time when they are able to grieve, because that ultimately is the main point. The Shiva Minyan and the community support is there to help the mourner, but the mourner needs to grieve in the first place, which Shiva makes time for.
Conservatives don't use Rabbanon, do they?
Kaddish to Rabbanan? Of course. Of course we do. Yes.
I see it in the shul.
Well, at around 9:37,
Yeah.
we say it every Shabbat morning. On Sunday morning minyans, when we have a minyan, we say that. And in the community minyan, we also do Kaddish to Rabbanan. So
That's me. I think that-
I don't want to point fingers, but yes, we do. It's just Kaddish to Rabbanan in the liturgy usually comes early on in the service. So it's one of the first parts of the service rather than later on, because that first part of the service is when we do text study, and so we specifically do Kaddish to Rabbanan there. So yes, it is still part of the conservative movement's liturgy. Just look back at, what is it, like page 160, 154, somewhere between 150, 160 in the Shabbat Siddur, and it's right there. Okay, great. Thank you all very much for coming. And we do have class next week as we begin Shemot.
But that's tonight.
Oh, we do have class tonight as well for Mishnah. Yes, Mishnah class tonight, 7 o'clock. We're still working our way through Psachim, the halacha for Passover. So if you're interested in knowing more about Passover as it was practiced during the time of the Mishnah, please stop by. You can also check out the recordings on YouTube.
What time is 7 o'clock?
7 o'clock.
All right.